Roxanne Perret, and with me today I have Katie Gillis. Katie is a psychotherapist, author, and advocate with a passion for working with survivors of relationship and family trauma. Her recent book, Invisible Bruises: How a Better Understanding of the Patterns of Domestic Violence Can Help Survivors Navigate the Legal System, sheds light on the ways that the legal system can perpetuate the cycle of domestic violence by failing to recognize patterns that would otherwise hold perpetrators accountable and protect survivors.
Roxanne is the LGBTQ plus victim advocate at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. She earned her bachelor's in clinical psychology from the University of Central Florida in 2021. She's currently in the Master's of Social Work program at UCF and is set to graduate in summer of 2024. She's passionate about bringing awareness to abuse and sexual violence experienced by LGBTQ plus people.
Thank you so much, Katie, for being here, and
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone who is watching this, because we're very grateful that people want to learn about domestic violence, and the way that it may look different and the way that it impacts LGBTQ plus individuals. So before we get started, it's really important to go over definitions. So in order to really understand domestic violence, we really have to go into depth into what every kind of abuse is and what it looks like. So Katie, could you describe the different kinds of abuse, and could you give an example of what that may look like?
Absolutely. So we have six major kinds right here of six definitions of six kinds of abuse. So you have emotional, psychological, physical, economic, cultural, and sexual. So emotional, that is like more of like the name calling, making fun of, that kind of stuff. Psychological is more of like the mental anguish. So when you have the gaslighting, playing with someone's mind, playing with their reality, their mentality, things like that. Physical is when you have any kind of like pushing, shoving, choking, using your body to harm another person's body, or using an object to harm another person's body. Economic is really the financial abuse. And so this is when you see really kind of both sides of the coin. So you see either the perpetrator not allowing the victim to have any finances, or you see the perpetrator racking up all kinds of debt, things like that, in either in the couple's name, the family's name, or in the victim's name. And so the victim is kind of like faced with all this debt. Cultural, so any kind of like religious or cultural, like taking advantage of them in that way, refusing to let them do anything involving their religion or anything with their faith, and refusing to allow them to practice their faith, refusing to allow them to practice their culture or participate in their culture. And sexual, so sexual is any kind of unwanted sexual touching or any kind of coercive sexual touching without consent or things like that.
Thank you so much. Those were very good descriptions of the different kinds of abuse, and it's really important to show that abuse is not only physical, because for most people, when they think of abuse, it is like hitting someone, slapping someone, etc. But there are other kinds of abuse that are just as harmful to someone's mental health,
Mhm.
and they're just as like hurtful for someone who's living through that. And
Oh
so,
yeah.
but because they don't leave physical bruises, they are often not acknowledged enough. So that's really important to talk about. So thank you so much. And then another thing, when we talk about LGBTQIA domestic violence, it's important to know what the letters stand for, because the LGBTQIA plus community as a whole, as an umbrella, is very important, but we also have to identify the expansions of every letter that falls within that umbrella. So the L stands for lesbian, the G stands for gay, the B stands for bisexual, the T stands for transgender, the Q stands for queer, the I stands for intersex, and the A stands for asexual. And there is a plus, and that's because there are many diverse kinds of identities that fall within the LGBTQIA plus umbrella, and the plus is really meant to incorporate all of those identities as well. So another thing that's important to talk about when we talk about domestic violence is it's not about love. It never is. It's always about controlling another person. So there was actually a power and control wheel that was designed to show different kinds of power and control techniques that abusers will use on their victims. So Katie, if you could go over um, the different sections of the power and control wheel, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So, all right. So the power and control wheel. So we have using coercion and threats. So that's like making or carrying out threats to do something to harm you, driving recklessly to frighten you, anything like that, kind of like threatening, like if you do this, I'll blank. Using intimidation, so making you afraid by using looks, gestures, actions, abusing pets, anything like that. Using emotional abuse, so putting you down, making fun of you, making you feel bad about yourself, calling you names, playing mind games. Isolation, controlling what you do, who you see, where you go, who you talk to, limiting any kind of outside activities. And you can see that with like not letting people see other families and not letting people go to work or associate people from work. Denying, minimizing, and blame. So making light of the abuse, saying it didn't happen, shifting responsibility for abusive behavior. Using children, making you feel guilty about the children, using children to relay messages, threatening to take the children away, or saying things like you'll never see your children again. Threatening to call Department of Family and Children Services. I don't know what it's called in different states, but threatening to call child control, or threatening to call child protection or family protection. Using privilege, so treating you like a servant or making all the big decisions in the home or with the relationship, being the one to define the partner's roles or duties in the relationship. And then using economic abuse, so preventing you from getting or keeping a job, making you ask for money, interfering with work or education, and things like that.
Okay, thank you so much. And you gave really great examples of what that may look like for victims that are living through that on a day-to-day basis. So, which is really important because there are a lot of people that are currently living through this that don't really identify that as abuse. Maybe because they haven't seen anything else in their lives, and also maybe because like they've just unfortunately they've been through this for so long that they're like, oh, all relationships are like this, and that's why it's really important to talk about it because everyone deserves to feel appreciated and loved in a relationship. And if you are being mistreated and harmed in any manner, that's not love, and it's abuse. So another portion that's really important, specifically within LGBTQ plus relationships, is how transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, heterosexism can be used within the relationship as a power and control technique. So, for example, for transgender individuals, that would be hiding or destroying hormones that a transgender individual may be taking, because that really has a devastating effect on like both physically and emotionally if they don't have access to their hormones. They're taking their hormones as for gender affirming care, and preventing them from accessing that is abuse. So and then an abusive partner can coerce a transgender survivor by calling like certain body parts by the wrong names, or threatening to send nude photos of the survivor either pre-transition or post-transition, and that's called revenge porn. Specifically after a couple has broken up, where there's this person that's sending out pictures that were sent privately, sending it to other people, and that can be very harmful because it was something that's very secret, and it was supposed to be private, and sent to this one person. It's being shared around without the person's consent. And other ways of power and control within LGBTQ plus relationships would be threatening to out someone in their workplace because maybe their workplace is not as LGBTQ plus accepting, and so threatening to out them, knowing that they could lose their income, is really a power control technique, and it's meant to put the person down and make them live in fear. Another way to another example of this would be, for example, biphobia would be to repeatedly accuse someone of cheating solely because of their sexual orientation. So there are really many different ways that abuse may look different in LGBTQ plus relationships, and of course, um, for example, like medical abuse, which is hiding or destroying hormones. This can also be seen in cisgender heterosexual relationships where, like, hiding life-saving medication. So there are all of these things, all of these abuse techniques that Katie mentioned can also obviously be seen in LGBTQ plus relationships, but there are even more um, power and control techniques that can be seen specifically in LGBTQ plus relationships, because they might be in the closet or because they're transgenders. So it's really important to talk about them because if not, the survivors are not going to be able to see their struggles being talked about and being discussed, and so they don't know if when they come forward they'll be believed, because the conversation around domestic violence is so focused on cisgender heterosexual couples. So another thing that is important to mention is myths and the impact that they play on the way that domestic violence is viewed within the LGBTQ plus community. So one of them would be that domestic violence is mostly a straight issue and does not occur often in LGBTQ relationships. That is completely wrong. Mostly it's not, people don't report. So
Yeah.
you can't know the numbers if people are not coming forward and telling their story and telling what happened to them.
Hmm.
And so it's not mainly a straight issue. And it's not only like a cisgender man on cisgender woman. Like,
Hmm.
um, men can also be survivors of domestic violence. So it's really important to make sure to broaden the conversation and not just keep it very, very narrow. Oh, this only happens to this group of people, because then
Hmm.
people who don't fit within those categories, they don't know who to turn to for support because their experiences are not being talked about, their experiences are not being validated. So Katie, could you talk about another myth that LGBTQ plus people really see within domestic violence?
Yeah, so another one is that incidents of domestic violence are less severe in LGBTQ relationships than when it happens in straight relationships. And the thing is like that's just not true. And I can't remember exactly, but I when I was doing the research for my book, I found that I believe it was bisexual women who are experienced it the most. However, I always want to give the disclaimer that, we really can't know for sure because I'm sure that there's a huge tendency to underreport for survivors, especially survivors who are trans, but maybe survivors who are men or survivors, because we live in a society that, they have to go through so many hurdles anyway to report. So I'm sure that there are so many people who aren't reporting. And so that definitely is definitely false.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then another one would be the more masculine, bigger, and or stronger partner is typically the abuser.
Hmm.
As Katie mentioned earlier, and as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many, many different
Hmm.
power control and abuse techniques that are not physical. There's not only
Hmm.
physical abuse. So there are other ways to manipulate and dehumanize another person that is not by being physically abusive.
Yeah.
So a person who's very, very like, not very, very strong can still be
Hmm.
an abuser through manipulation,
Oh
through
yeah.
psychological abuse and things like that. So
Mhm. Another one is that it is easier for LGBTQ victims to leave abusive relationships than it is for their straight and or married counterparts. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think that I think it's hard for most people to leave relationships regardless of your gender or sexuality. But I think that it's definitely probably harder for people to leave if you don't have the support that you need. And it's harder to get support if you're in a queer LGBTQ relationship because of the biases and the things that you're up against, the legal hurdles and things like that. So no, it's definitely not easier.
Mhm.
And then another myth is that women don't use force. And that's not true at all. There are, women who are, I mean, I have many clients who have had female perpetrators. And so that's definitely a myth. That's definitely false.
Yeah, and it's at the end of the day, it's a stereotype that
Yeah.
women are inherently feminine and
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that they can't, abuse another person, but anyone can be violent. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's at the end of the day, it's not based on muscle mass.
Yeah.
It's based on,
Power and control.
wanting to, yeah, power and
Yeah.
control over another person. So, um, and then another one that's really important, specifically when we're talking about domestic violence and the connection with sexual violence, is that the myth is that a woman can't be raped by another woman, a man can't be raped by another man, a transgender can't be raped or can't rape or be raped by a partner, and that's completely wrong. Perpetrators of sexual violence can be anyone. Victims of sexual violence can be anyone, gender, regardless of gender identity. So it's about inflicting and manipulating another person. So anyone can manipulate another person. So sexual violence is not solely a cisgender man on a cisgender woman issue. And the myth that a woman can be raped by another woman, a man can be raped by another man, etc., really prevents people that haven't had those experiences from talking about it because they don't see because this myth is so perpetrated in society, they don't want to come forward because they're not going to be believed because their experiences look different. So, and another thing that's also really important that we mentioned earlier, we mentioned how underreported domestic violence is. And so we need to highlight why it's so underreported. So why don't they come forward? If this happens so much, why aren't people going to the police, pressing charges, coming forward about what happened to them? And there are a lot of barriers that LGBTQ plus people face when coming forward about domestic violence. One of the big ones is really no knowledge of LGBTQ plus friendly resources. So like if they reach out to a domestic violence organization, is the organization going to validate that they are in a LGBTQ plus
Mm-hmm.
relationship and that their experiences are real, or are they going to be like, oh, like for example, a gay man experiencing domestic violence, oh, you should have fought back, or why didn't you, um, why weren't you stronger, and why didn't you stop him from hitting you, and things like that. So it's really important to make sure that people in every community knows that there are LGBTQ plus friendly domestic violence organizations, so that if they are in those relationships, they know who to turn to. Because being in those relationships is already obviously very traumatic and dehumanizing and
Mm-hmm.
very painful and harmful. And so if they don't know who to turn to for support when they do get out or when they're trying to get out and they have to do it on their own, that makes it significantly harder. Another one would be conversation around domestic violence is solely focused on heterosexual relationships. So for example, social media posts, if the social media posts are solely focused on women experiencing domestic violence, then people who don't fit those categories are don't feel represented and don't feel like they would be heard if they um, contacted people, if they contacted an agency for support. So another one would be fear, isolation, especially when the victim is not out to their loved ones for their safety. The abuser can use that as a technique to isolate them, um, or to threaten to out them to their family as a way to make them afraid. And then other ways that they often don't come forward, don't leave, would be no way to leave the relationship. That would be no car, no job, no like income, disabilities, and then also there are I'm not specifically knowledgeable on the specific legal standards around domestic violence, that would probably be more your thing, Katie. But like the legal definition of domestic violence excluding same-sex couples also makes it hard for LGBTQ plus people to come forward. And then the dangers of outing oneself when seeking
Hmm.
help, and the lack of LGBTQ plus friendly resources, the potential homophobia from the service providers, or um, or the uncertainty of whether the case will go to court, and if the person will face consequences for the abuse that they inflicted. So
Hmm.
these barriers really prevent LGBTQ plus domestic violence victims from coming forward about their experiences, and that's why the research, I'm sure that the research is not exactly accurate on the numbers, even if the
Hmm.
numbers are still already very high. So I do have a question for Katie. So when they do come forward and report, do you know anything regarding like the legal process, and if there will be a conviction, does it look different for LGBTQ plus survivors?
So the first thing that I always want to mention, so for my clients who are survivors and are trying to get protection, the hardest thing is really like getting to be believed, and the hardest thing with that is really sometimes even like walking through the door. And so, um, the first thing is like the law enforcement and things like that. We have a very traditional legal society and things like that, and so a lot of times the paperwork, you fill out the paperwork, and I know it's different in each states, but a lot of times the paperwork will even have like gender specific, and only until recently in certain states could you even apply for protection order against like a same-sex partner, ex-partner, things like that. So that was one huge barrier that I hope is changing. So the number one thing, reporting does not always lead to protection. If you report, especially if you're reporting non physical abuse, things like harassment and stalking, it a lot of times it comes down to, what proof do you have, and the biases that come from our system, our domestic violence system. And so the barriers that many of my clients face in presenting their cases for many of the reasons that I see are things like biases, things like transphobia, homophobia, things like that. And it's not only, kind of like you mentioned before, it's not only my LGBTQ clients, a lot of my male clients who are straight heterosexual men have trouble getting protection if their abuser is a female, and a lot of my gay male clients have trouble getting protection if their abuser is a male. That's just like that runs deep just in our society and our culture of like what we consider a stereotype, or a stereotypical domestic violence victim, so to speak. So the next thing is, the survivor may have been, arrested based on stereotypes that abuse in queer relationships is mutual, or that the bigger, stronger, more masculine partner is the abuser. And I always think of the examples of my clients who I have a couple who's a gay couple, and the one who is the more stereotypically feminine presenting person, he's shorter, much more feminine presenting. He was the one who was the abuser, but the other one was assumed to be the perpetrator just because he was bigger and just more like physically appeared to be more physically threatening. And so when the police arrived, they just kind of assumed. So that is something that's very common that they're up against. Um, Survivors are going to be less likely to report the abuse to the police or medical providers, due to fear of mistreatment or outing, because reporting things to the police and reporting things to medical providers is a very like intrusive process. There's a lot of questions involved, and a lot of times they're asking you questions about your relationship or things about what happened. You're having to kind of restate things 7 different times, and it can be a very intrusive process. And sometimes my clients will say to me like it's easier to just kind of like not have to do that. So that is one big barrier, especially if you're having to educate the person or explain to them things while you're reporting. That is a huge barrier. So they're going to be really reluctant to make that report. And that really brings me to my next point of survivors being really reluctant to disclose in their petitions. You know, they don't want to out themselves in their petitions. A lot of times my clients will say, look, I don't feel like outing myself to my community, to my job, to my family, to my, you know, if I'm a person of faith, you know, my faith organization and things like that. Because I mean, I live in Louisiana, and there are places that, you know, you still can lose your job for that. And so it is state dependent, but um you know, so that is something that many of my clients are up against. Like, do I want to risk outing myself and the repercussions that could come for that, employment or family? You know, maybe my family isn't going to, you know, support me. So what's worth it? Getting the support that I need, and the protection that I need, and losing my family? You know, these are literally the discussions that my clients are having. Like, what's worse? You know, not having the protection that I need, or losing my family? Not having the protection I need, or like losing my, you know, my faith organization turning away from me, my job, my community, that kind of thing. So these are really the conversations that we're having. Um Survivors may feel that officers or staff will be hostile, or make fun of them. And, you know, and I understand that's a huge real fear, just because of the world that we live in. And so that's the kind of a huge barrier, that fear. And so some ways that courts can address these barriers is by recognizing the distinct issues that may be presented in cases involving these clients, and especially if you have, you know, more inclusive language in your paperwork, or maybe different terminology in your paperwork and that kind of stuff. It can be more inclusive and not make people feel othered when they report.
Yeah, those are really great points, and it's really important to make sure that to go through either paperwork and policies for organizations to make sure that everything is inclusive of all experiences, all gender identities, all sexual orientations, all races, etc. So, and honestly, it's really important for organizations in general to try to do better, because as we just mentioned, there are all these barriers that they're facing to report. So the easier you can organizations can make it, and the more welcoming they can be, and the more they can advocate for this person, the better, because there's a lot of times they're going to face um, homophobia throughout this whole process. And so if they have a support system, at least they're not facing that themselves. And also, the advocates can make sure that every single resource and referral that they're giving is trained um, on LGBTQ plus identities and experiences, so that this person is not re-traumatized and having to explain their identity to a service provider. And because they've already been through something that is awful, and they're trying to explain what happened to them, they don't have the time to explain what transgender means. They shouldn't have to explain what transgender is.
Yeah.
So it's really important for all service providers that have direct contact with survivors to know all the different terms under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. Another thing that specifically at the Victim Service Center we really like to focus on is sexual violence. That's one of our biggest. That's basically our biggest mission. But we serve all survivors of violent crimes and traumatic experiences. But we are also the Rape Crisis Center for Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties. So sexual violence is really the topic that we really focus on. And a few things that I really like to mention, because I feel like they're not really talked about in terms of domestic violence specifically, would be marital rape. I believe it didn't become a crime until 1993, and so that's very very late. And basically, for those that don't know, marital rape is sexually assaulting a spouse. So a person who is married to you does not owe you sex when they don't want to have sex. Just because you are married does not mean anything. The other person still has to give consent. A wedding ring doesn't take away their ability to give consent. So it's really important to make sure that this is talked about because unfortunately in a lot of relationships, like, oh, you're married to me, like you owe me this. Like, married or wife isn't real. It is a real issue. And unfortunately, because it's not talked about a lot of times in terms of domestic violence, a lot of people don't come forward. Um, Rape of an intimate partner is similar without the marriage component where, oh, we're in a relationship, so you owe me this. Or like another example would be coercion, which is very similar, where basically you're manipulating the other person into consenting, but it's not really consenting because you can only consent by saying yes. So you're basically
Mhm.
manipulating the other person into giving up and changing their mind,
Mhm.
which is not consent. Uh,
Mhm.
Giving up because you're repeatedly being like repeatedly asking them and bothering them,
Pressuring them to
yeah,
say yes.
pressuring them basically,
Mhm.
is not consent because they said no. They said no multiple
Mhm.
times, and you're not willing to listen to that, and you're trying to get them to change their mind. That is coercion. And another example would be through like going out on a date and being like, oh, we went on a date, I paid for dinner, I gave
Mhm.
you a gift for Christmas, blah blah blah. So now you owe me this. You are
Mhm.
like your body is your own, and no one should make you feel like you owe them anything because they gave you something. A gift is a
Mhm.
gift. Buying dinner, that's a choice. That does not mean that anyone owes you anything. And so it's really important to make sure that people know that they can still um, they can still say no if someone bought them dinner or something. But the thing
Yeah.
is, oftentimes coercion is not talked about because assault is seen as this like physical assault, so like forcing someone down, and it's not really talked about the whole manipulating someone into changing their mind. And even if someone like doesn't say no, even if they stay silent, they don't say anything.
Mhm.
Um, that's not a yes.
Mhm.
At the VSC, we really like to talk about enthusiastic consent and how the only consent is enthusiastic consent. Because like if anyone's doing anything like partaking in any sexual activity, they should be enthusiastic. They should not be completely shut down, completely quiet, or saying no. And you're changing their mind because that is sexual assault. Anything other than enthusiastic consent is not consent. So, and then another thing specifically related to domestic violence, queer domestic violence, Katie, in your experience, has there been specific mental health impacts that you've seen in queer survivors of domestic violence that that are seen differently in cisgender heterosexual survivors?
Yeah, I do. And so when I work with survivors who are heterosexual, cis, their identity isn't brought into their survivorship. So, for example, they're seen as a survivor just because they're a survivor, and like that's the only thing that that matters. Um, However, my queer clients, it's like their sense of self and their every being is brought into question. So there's a lot of shaming, there's a lot of self-shaming, there's societal shaming, and so that is a huge part of it because it's like so much of the blame that comes from the relationship shouldn't exist anyway. The gender identity shouldn't exist anyway. Your gender identity is wrong, your relationship was wrong. And I'm not saying that these are the things that they're necessarily believing, or the messages that they're necessarily getting explicitly, but those are the messages that we as a society send to queer people anyway, just in our world that we live in. And so a lot of my clients are really up against that. It's like the self shame of like their very being and who they are comes into play just from being a survivor too.
Mm. So it would be kind of like, would this have happened to me if I wasn't in the LGBTQ plus community?
Sometimes that's a huge part of it, or like, oh, this happened to me. It's like a lot of my clients who are faithful, they're saying, oh well, this has happened to me, because my relationship is a sin, or like, or their family will say to them, this is because your relationship is a sin, or things like that will be something that they really struggle with. Like, is this because I was, wrong? Am I wrong? Maybe I shouldn't have been at that bar anyway, or maybe I shouldn't have been out, on Bourbon Street anyway. I mean, maybe it's my fault. I mean, look at the people who I'm hanging out with. Like, those are the messages that like we send to queer people, and like by minimizing their experiences and their life and their like social outlets and things like that. And so when we're already doing that, then they come forward as a survivor, that they're already minimized. So it's like their sense of self is really brought into question.
Mhm. Yeah, and from what I hear, there is a lot of like victim blaming, whether like on the outside and the inside.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy for specifically like me when I'm in the community to be like, oh, like it's never the perpetrator's fault. It's never the victim's fault.
Mm-hmm.
It's never the
Mm-hmm.
victim's fault. It's always the
Yeah.
perpetrator. But at the same time, it's incredibly hard for survivors to convince themselves of that because
Mm-hmm.
society is
Mm-hmm.
saying loads of things, and even if you have one person in your corner that's like, hey, not your fault, like it's definitely the
It's like
perpetrator.
one thing to say it, it's another thing to really believe it. Yeah.
Exactly. It takes a lot for
Mm-hmm.
survivors to believe that themselves in their own
Mm-hmm.
experience. So,
Yeah.
and the last thing that I wanted to bring up is why is it important to talk about this? So, most studies found that a lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence among LGBTQ people that is high or higher than the general population. So that doesn't give an exact number. And of course, we're never going to get an exact number on the prevalence of
Yeah.
LGBTQ plus because LGBTQ
Mm-hmm.
plus domestic violence, because of the barriers we mentioned earlier. These barriers
Mm-hmm.
are going to take a very, 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 very long time to deconstruct.
Yeah.
So if one day the statistics are perfect and you know survivors all feel safe to come forward,
Mm-hmm.
that would be great. But I would also prefer sexual violence to just and domestic violence in general to just in a perfect world domestic violence would not exist. That
Yeah.
that is very important, but also in order to properly talk about domestic violence within the LGBTQ plus community, we have to acknowledge that it is a real issue and that it may look different
Mm-hmm.
than cisgender heteronormative relationships. And
Mm-hmm.
then really talking about it helps people identify that what they're experiencing is abuse and that it isn't normal. Because many times in abusive relationships, it's a person's like first relationship.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't know what love is supposed to feel like, what love is supposed to
Mm-hmm.
feel like. So if we have these conversations, people can identify within their relationships, and even not even just like um, romantic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
There can be abuse in all types of relationships where people are being abusive, but because no one talks about power and control tactics or abuse, different kinds of abuse, they don't know that
Mm-hmm.
it's domestic violence. So,
Yeah, it's just so normalized for a lot of my clients who experience it, especially in their family of origin. So I do think that normalizing the conversation is going to help to, make survivors feel more like, okay, this is something that I can overcome. And
mm-hmm.
just normalizing the conversations around trauma and abuse.
Yeah, that's really important. So, thank you very much, Katie, for being here.
Thank you
Um,
for having me.
and thank you to everyone who is watching. We hope that you've learned about LGBTQ plus domestic violence, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.